Welcome to episode 174 of A Pint with Seaniebee. I'm here with the Don. Hello, the Don.
Hello.
We've got a great show for you today. We're going to be joined again by our resident futurist, Mr. Richard Watson, who has been a futurist for many years, as he'll tell us in his introduction. What are you hoping to get from Richard today?
Lottery numbers.
Lottery numbers, and we're going to talk a little bit about what the outcome is for society, for humans, following the pandemic. Are we going to change our wicked ways? Are we going to make the world a better place? Let's patch in Richard, who joins us from his home in London. And laying back like a Greek god being fed grapes in his house in London is Richard Watson. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you, and hello both.
Richard is a futurist who runs a company called Now and Next and has been a futurist since I've known him. And in fact, I was with Richard when he was dabbling in Australia with becoming a futurist. I don't know how you become a futurist, but he's been one for 20 odd years now, right?
I'd say since about 2004, 5, something like that. Oh, I know. No, since 2006 when I started writing a book.
And you've now written how many books?
Well, I've written 7, but so far only 5 are published.
That's quite a lot.
Actually, I have a question about that because we were in Sean's mum's house yesterday and I was chatting to your mum and she was just asking us if we had any plans. And I said, we're going to do an episode of the podcast tomorrow. We have a futurist we're going to talk to. And she said, what's a futurist? And I was like, he looks into the future and stuff. And she's like, so is this like astrology and that kind of stuff? And I was like, no. It's like, and I realised I haven't a fucking clue. And she said, well, is it the day job? Like, how does what? I don't know. You'd have to ask Sean.
There's another deep question. What is even the future? I mean, in my case, I read, think, discuss, write about the future. As to what the future is, I mean, I'm not talking about next Tuesday, generally. I'm 5 to 10 years out. There's quite a lot of faux futurists around these days. I think they're just trend people, which is where I came from, who are just taking what's happening now and extrapolating 18 months, which, I suppose that's vaguely a futurist, but I think you need to sort of bang up against science fiction a bit to be interesting. I think you need to go out, at least 10 years, maybe 20 or even more to be really interesting. I think actually what I do most of the time is I'm a sort of excuse that allows people to reflect about what they're doing. I think that's possibly what I really do.
So the big question for the start of today's podcast is, when is the world going to end?
Oh, I don't really care. I don't know. I don't care. There was something, actually, I did a risk map once with extreme risks. And I remember it was great. Quoting an Oxford, I think, study saying we were going to make it to the end of the century with about a 98.5% probability. So it's not really something I worry about. So this time last year, we were talking to you kind of just as the pandemic was in the early throes. We were wondering if there was going to be a second wave, not to mind a fourth wave. Ireland has just come out of the worst lockdown of any country. We were locked down for over 5 months and we're just beginning to emerge now. The Indian virus is here. How would you give humankind, what sort of scorecard would you give humankind on how we've handled the whole pandemic when it arrived on our plate a year ago? I think I'm not going to put a number on it, but I think we did as well as could be expected. I mean, everyone was trying hard. Some people proved to be idiots, but they didn't mean to be necessarily. The countries we thought were really good early on turned out to be not so good. I mean, Britain did make some huge errors, I think. I mean, going back before the pandemic, we'd obviously thought about pandemics, but we managed to model the wrong kind, which was pretty genius. And then I think we locked down far too late. We arguably opened up far too early. Although, who were we trying to save at the end of the day? What were we trying to do? And I'm still not quite sure what the answer to that is. Well, I think certainly the view from Ireland was our health services are not fit for purpose. So in Ireland, the HSE, which is the NHS of Ireland, is running all the time at like 99 to 100% capacity. Huge waiting lists, trolleys in corridors. Something like 500,000 people are waiting for outpatients in a population of 5 million. Yeah. And when a panic comes along or a pandemic,
the biggest fear is, what we saw in Italy, army being called in to collect bodies, what we're seeing in India, makeshift funeral pyres, that kind of end of world view, which we were desperately trying to avoid. And we kind of did over here. And I think now with the vaccines, we realize, okay, the health service will be able to control and run if the numbers start getting bad again. So we have a health systems, in America, in Britain, here, not so much maybe in Australia, New Zealand, in first world English speaking countries, which are not fit for purpose and getting worse because companies and governments are trying to blend capitalism with health, which we know kind of doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, I think the NHS has got some big problems. It had the problems before the pandemic. It was beginning to sort of creak and groan. It needs radical reform, but I don't think it'll ever happen. So we will lurch from one crisis to another. I mean, aging is putting enormous pressure on the NHS, obesity, enormous pressure. And obviously there's quite an interesting link with obesity and the people who got really ill during the pandemic. But yeah, we'll just sort of carry on, I guess, stick a few plasters over and carry on.
When we were talking last, we were talking about what does the world look like emerging from this lesson we've been handed. And we were talking, about work-life balances, working from home. Do you feel it's going to snap back to pretty much what it was? Or do you think that we will have learned some lessons and we will change?
I'm pretty certain that it's going to snap back to something very close to what we had before, which I'm not saying I want that to happen, but I think that's what will happen. This will be a sort of a year to forget, not one to remember. We're going to bury it in our collective memories. We're going to probably party like it's 2021 or whatever it is for a while. There are some residual effects, but I don't think there'll be many. I think work will be more flexible and fluid, but it's by no means the death of the office. The environment might move up the agenda a bit. Beyond that, I don't see too much changing.
So we had a sort of a very interesting, in my view, crossroads with the US election in November, where the last time we were talking to you, I asked you specifically if you thought Trump was going to be elected, and you called that pretty tight. That politicization of everything in the world, including the pandemic, including masks, including the climate, including everything, is a sort of a feature of what's happening across nearly everything now. And how worried should we be?
I mean, personally, I'm just not that interested. I'm just disengaged. I'll worry about things when they happen if I need to. It's sort of Love Island's "it is what it is" meets stoicism, I guess. I don't think it's going away because I think it's fundamentally driven by social media and connectivity, and ironically, I think at some level isolation and loneliness is driving this. There's quite an interesting book came out on this, which I haven't read it, but my God, that's an interesting thesis if it's true. I mean, wow. It's just something I don't want in my head. I don't care, which sounds awful, but I just don't want to know. I'm totally disengaged from it.
Did you feel it was appropriate for Twitter and Facebook to shut down Donald Trump?
That's really hard. I mean, first of all, why did it take so long for them to do it? You mean you'll wait until he's no longer got any power and then you're going to ban him? It goes against things I believe in. I don't think people should be banned from saying things at all. If they want to say something, they should be allowed to say it. But on the other hand, he was a hateful person. So I'm not quite sure what to say about that. And obviously, don't assume he's gone. I mean, he could very, very easily be back. And again, that's just not something I particularly want to think about right now.
The crossroads was that we very nearly got another 4 years of Donald Trump, and the world would be in far more peril if that had happened. Would you agree?
Yes, I do agree. I think he really would have gone rogue at that point. I can't remember which American congressman or senator said that, but yeah, I think he would have gone absolutely rogue. It would have just been horrendous. I mean, I'm surprised by how little problems they've had in the US, although actually it's interesting how very little US news you get these days, or any global news period anymore. It's all totally localized, focused on the pandemic. But I thought there would be more trouble. And I do think a lot of stuff that happened was exaggerated as well, to some extent. But it was surreal. I mean, again, this is why I just can't think about this stuff anymore, because how do you out crazy that? But yeah, I mean, I could just about cope with the pandemic. I could just about cope with Trump as president, but I really struggle with having both happen at the same time.
But like Biden, has arrived and he's rolled up his sleeves and backed out of the kind of he said, she said nature of US politics and got his vaccination situation into action, but also brought America back to the climate table, which wouldn't have happened. And I think, do you have any faith that we might understand the lesson from the pandemic about how important now the other pandemic, which is climate change, is going to affect us all and we might get our shit together? Or do you think it'll just be the usual platitudes?
A little bit of both. My inner cynic says, again, not a lot. It'll progress. It'll go in the right direction, but I'm not sure it'll move as fast as it needs to be. Although, I mean, okay, so we decarbonize or we're carbon neutral by 2030 or whatever it is. I think my personal view is it's too late to do anything really. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything, but you're not going to stop it. It's going to do what it's going to do, and we will have to adapt. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't change things. But it'd be a shame if we just did that and nothing else, because I think the pandemic has highlighted a lot of issues. And we had the sort of mental space during lockdown 1 to actually think about this. People had the time for the first time to stop and think about how they were living their lives. And a lot of people were really thinking deeply about, if this was my last year on Earth, how would I live differently? Am I spending too much time at work? Have I got the wrong job, et cetera, et cetera? And people thought quite deeply about it. And I think that's now gone. It's just sort of drifted off into the sunset. I mean, Black Lives Matter, I think, will carry on. That's got a sort of force to it now. Climate, I think, to some extent, but inequality, I don't think we're going to do much about that. Global financial system, definitely not. Although, again, I don't necessarily see this as ending. First of all, the pandemic is far from over, and we've barely started to feel any effects whatsoever of the financial aftermath. And if anything, I'd be more worried about that now than the actual pandemic. So it's very early days. It's very tempting to think this is all sort of behind us now, but I don't feel like that at all. I think in certain countries it's quite back to normal. I'm not anxious about it at all, but I don't think it's over, that's for sure.
The sort of sudden change in economics as well of print money, throw money at the problem, don't worry about, versus the last financial collapse where it was all austerity and all this kind of stuff. There seems to have been a change in economics now. And with that, there's an opportunity to help build infrastructure, to help fix hospitals, to help fix schools, to put people back to work on fixing roads and, basic housing issues that we have over here particularly. Is that going to continue, or is that bullshit? Like, there's lots of old economists who go, no, you're going to have to pay the piper at some point.
No, I think you're going to have to pay at some point. And we've already got a problem paying with what we've spent already, let alone spending anything else. I mean, everyone was talking about tax rises not so long ago. That seems to have disappeared. I think they're going to come in a sort of stealth way, potentially. I do think inflation is going to come in. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, a small level of inflation will downplay the debt, so that's a good thing. But it could very easily get out of control. And it'll benefit certain people and not others as well. So it could actually increase inequality a bit like it did last time, the aftermath of the global financial crash. But we will have to see. But yeah, they suddenly sort of conjured money out of nowhere. But then again, I suppose you could say they didn't have any choice. Although, you've always got a choice to some extent. Although that sort of health wealth thing was always the tension. That was always that axis there. They kind of chose health. And they chose the health of everyone, or you might argue a certain segment of the population over, the financial well-being of everyone else. I mean, it does strike me that younger people have been sort of thrown to the wolves on this to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, I wondered, as we're talking about that, I was thinking it at the start when we were talking about climate change, but particularly now, I wonder how pissed off people are going to be. Like, there was a huge sense, certainly in Ireland, of civic duty and community and, clapping for the healthcare workers and all that kind of shit, and doing the right thing. And I'd say at this stage, particularly people who have been hit harder financially and aren't in a big 5-bed house with a massive garden, getting paid full the entire time they're off, I'd say there's going to be an awful lot of people pissed off and just fucking disinclined to be the hero. And I could see governments and that maybe taking climate change more seriously. But then you've got to have buy-in. And then you've got the same fucking people are going to be hammered. Same with any recession. The less well off will be less well off again. And they'll be pissed off. And we weren't all in it together, we're all in it together, but some of us are in a smaller boat. I can see the residual anger in a lot of people for a couple of years to come, just disinclined to do the right thing and give a shit about civic duty.
Yeah, it's interesting, the clapping for the NHS. I never thought that was what they were doing. I always felt people clapping themselves, actually, for still being there. I think, Black Lives Matter came about, I think, because the timing was absolutely perfect, because people were pissed off with something else. There was a sort of welling of resentment. And I think that does exist within the younger generation. They haven't been able to express it yet, really. I mean, I'm amazed at how little rebellion there's been around this, for people being effectively locked up for the best part of a year. I particularly feel sorry for university students who, the worst they've done is have a party and maybe put some post-it notes on their window saying help. But, they are paying full whack and they haven't seen a lecturer for a year. And I don't think there's much prospect of them seeing one this year either, really. I mean, they haven't even had a discount, for heaven's sake. I mean, I just can't believe there hasn't been more trouble there. But then, to what end? I don't know. Again, there are so many variables now, and you can't rule anything out, really, any sort of crazy thoughts, that it just makes your head spin. Hence, I'm not really very engaged with it anymore.
So speaking of crazy, I was listening to an interesting podcast with Sam Harris the other week, and he had a guy on who studies pandemics, and he talks about this COVID-19 was mild, relatively speaking. Yep. So he's talking about one that's arrives where it kills 10% or 20% of people, where people are terrified to go out. And guess who doesn't show up for work? The bin men, the lorry drivers, the people in shops don't turn up for work. And the world can collapse very quickly. He also talked a bit about the fact that you can weaponize viruses, and there's no controls being put over that. Now, on your risk map, you had an awful lot of these crazy things. I remember you saying, being hit by an asteroid and all this kind of stuff. That's starting to come into sharper focus, because you see lone wolf crazies in America, 240 mass shootings so far this year. Suddenly there's an opportunity to print a virus and release it without anybody kind of having any checks and balances over the materials required. And there's an awful lot of researchers who are deliberately tweaking viruses to make them more painful or more vicious, that they may then work out how to vaccinate against them. And the argument there is, don't bother trying to fucking make a more severe virus because someone drops a test tube in a lab and it's out. Have you any thoughts on that sort of more accelerating doomsday situation that we could have?
I'm just trying to think, did it expose a resilience or the opposite when this happened? You're absolutely right about this not being particularly dangerous in the grand scheme of things. I mean, what was the mortality rate? About 1.5%, 2%? I mean, some of these I'm thinking of MERS, but there are some that are around the 40, 50% mortality rate. And you're right. I mean, the infrastructure, I think, would just completely fall to pieces at that point. I mean, that's a scenario. I'm not saying it would happen. It's a scenario that could happen. I mean, there are sort of plenty of things. I mean, I quite like, a solar flare could knock out satellite communications. All of a sudden, you have to start reading paper maps again because nothing will work. And a bunch of other stuff. There are reasons the internet could fail. There's just so many things. Although actually the more likely ones are quite boring. It's the collapse of antibiotic efficacy, or just obesity, or mental illness becomes a sort of plague, which we may yet get that one. The problem is possibly back to this connectivity, both digitally and physically. So risks that used to be local have now become global. They're systemic. Therefore, your exposure is much greater. And if you're intent on doing a bad thing, it's a lot easier these days. And you're absolutely right. I mean, you could cook up something really quite nasty. And there's a level of sophistication to it as well. You could take out certain ethnicities with a certain virus as well. You could get that sophisticated. And it's much more difficult to control than some other things. But again, I think you just have to sort of think, well, it's not happened. I'm not going to worry about it unless you want to sort of go and live the rest of your life in a nuclear fallout shelter. I just think you have to. It's not happened. If it did, there probably wouldn't be a great deal I could do about it. So why fill my mind with it, really?
It's kind of a little bit scary, though, to think that, in the last 12 months, we put a helicopter on Mars. We built 6 that were over 70% efficacious against a global pandemic in record time and got them into arms. And yet there's this other part of being a human being. Nuclear war is still lingering in the background. This idea of self-annihilation, this idea of bioterrorism, all of these things are kind of sitting there, and they feel an awful lot closer because we can see what crazy... I mean, one of the actual solutions this guy had to stopping this from happening was, of course, putting in checks and balances with special bodies that monitored where these proteins or whatever were sent out to and who could get hold of them. But one of his solutions was spend money on mental health so we don't have crazy people who would do something. I mean, it's that macro, you know?
Like, the problem with that, I was just saying, we're talking about this, it's like, we can't be trusted with the level of intelligence we have, because most people aren't that intelligent, but like the level of intelligence we as a society and a world have access to, we're just fucking shit. We're a shitty species. Like, we cannot be fucking trusted. And then, like, I have to laugh at, like, the only solution your man had was, we have to invest in mental health. Now, the minute I fucking hear that, I just go, right, shut up. Because mental health, like, they're the two words I can't stand here together. It's a giant umbrella that we put up when we mean mental health could mean fucking anything. Mental health is like when we put an ad on the radio and say, you know, mind your mental health, talk to your friends, meaning we're not going to do anything. So mental illness is a very different thing to mental health. Not that mental health isn't relevant, but are we going to look at actual mental illness? Because we have fuck all research on that. We think we know loads. Like the DSM-5 is literally just a group of symptoms that we kind of put a name on things. We don't understand nearly all mental illnesses. Like, that's, I don't think people realize that we can do nuclear shit, but we still haven't figured out mental illness. Then on top of that, mental health is much more kind of society and situational, and we're fucked if we feel like actually making sure that everybody has a good go at things. Like, nobody in power actually really wants everybody to be equal enough, so we don't care about people's situation. So we put up the big mental health umbrella, stick a few stickers around the place and tell people well done, and put up some nice radio ads on. But mental health is just a phrase we use when we mean we're not going to fucking do anything.
I was just going to say, actually, not relating to that, but there's a sort of self-loathing in the population to some extent within certain segments that, you know, we've messed things up, we no longer deserve to be here. There is that sort of bubbling around. Quite a dystopic. But, you know, there's always been stuff that was out there that could kill us. We've always been stupid. The best thing that came out of the pandemic was our ingenuity. You know, when our backs are against the wall, we can be very smart indeed. And, we sequenced this and we saw the vaccine very, very quickly. So we're not, we're far from all bad, and we do some great stuff. And the other thing is, again, this sort of dystopic thing. Okay, admittedly, we've gone through a really bad 12 months, but, nobody was sending their kids over the trenches in the First World War kind of thing. It's still, on virtually any measure that matters, the best time to be alive. I mean, if you look at longevity, infant mortality, extreme poverty, death from wars and serious crime, number of women in education and employment, literacy rates, it's just, you can't debate it. It is the best time to be alive ever. Yet we don't see that. We're sort of totally focused on the negatives. There is something going on now, and I can't really articulate it, there has been a shift due to this. And it wasn't just due to the pandemic, I don't think. I think there's some other things going on as well. It was happening anyway. But there's been a sort of shift in, again, I'm struggling to explain this. Can't really think of the words at all. But I think some kind of strange change might possibly be coming. Yeah, no, I've yet to read anybody articulate this either. I just can't quite explain it, but there's almost something in the air, and maybe it's as simple as there's a thirst for change. Maybe that's all it is, and nobody yet has articulated what the change could be. So that's a sort of a hopeful thing as well, potentially.
I mean, do you have any stock in everything from, fifth dimension, spirituality, ayahuasca, religion, supernatural? I mean, does any of that start coming onto the table? Like, that there's something that we kind of appreciate that we don't know, although the idea of there being stuff like a god or whatever is preposterous and so outlandishly ridiculous to think about, yet still billions of us kneel down and pretend to pray to a god.
There could be a sort of new spiritual paradigm. I mean, I was quite surprised. I mean, we haven't got data on all sorts of things yet from the last 12 months, but I was slightly surprised there wasn't sort of emergence of a sort of new sort of religion or spirituality, or maybe even going back to sort of normal religion. I mean, the one thing I've noticed recently that has bizarrely come through this is going to sound weird. I think there might be sort of arts and crafts too on the horizon. This, in the same way that sort of William Morris almost came out of the Industrial Revolution. If you take sort of things like this virus and AI and all the rest of it, we might be sort of going back to craft and local. I mean, there was something in the Financial Times, I think, at the weekend about this sort of cottage crafty, it's practically Laura Ashley, ridiculously impossible lifestyles. You know, it's all floaty dresses and chickens and homemade honey. And there could be this sort of anti-modernist, not necessarily anti-technology, but anti-modern. Or actually, going back to your very first question, it's almost the opposite of futurism. Futurism being the art movement, not people like me. Italy and so on in the early 30s, wasn't it? They loved technology, they loved speed, they hated libraries, interestingly. They worshipped war. So it's the opposite of that.
Yeah, what you're describing to me sounds an awful lot like the hipster thing of 10 years ago. And what I see now, like I'm 31, and what I see a lot of that age group and younger is like specific to the religion question, because I hadn't thought about that, but I'd say the emerging religion that has become much more strengthened throughout the pandemic is like wokest day, as I call it. It's like, the woke religion. But if you look at how the far left idea of you have to say this, otherwise it's blasphemy. We, like in Ireland, we just voted out blasphemy for our constitution a couple of years ago, and now we're bringing it in hate speech. It's just fucking blasphemy. But it's almost religious, and it's tribal, and I do see the loneliness making people want to belong to a tribe. But what I can't get over is that almost every other woman my age seems to be listening to murder podcasts while crocheting. 23, 24-year-olds crocheting things constantly. It's just crochet, it's growing things. It is the floaty dresses, but with septum piercings and green hair. It's almost like this outward need to tell everybody, which is hipster, we're rejecting modernity and we're going back to retro and more natural and living with the earth. And steampunk, but we want the most modern phone so we can take a really good picture and filter it, so we put it on Instagram to tell everybody how traditional we are.
Yeah. I think that's happening. I mean, I'm still sort of slightly stuck where I am for a few years, but I intend to escape as soon as I can. I don't want to sort of live in this sort of westernized modern way anymore.
So where would you escape to? What have you in your head?
Well, I'm going to keep that secret, but it's not Australia. That's far too sophisticated.
A beach in Thailand.
I don't want to buy my groceries with a self-checkout robot beeping at me continually, or somebody that doesn't say hello. I don't want to suffer train services that don't work properly. I don't want to. I don't know. I would like to sort of go back to a sort of simpler way of living.
Richard, is it Switzerland? Is that where you're going? I was getting a bit worried there.
I have no desire to own a nuclear fallout shelter or a machine gun. Thank you. No, I'm thinking sort of fringes of Europe a bit. Let's just leave it there. I'm not sure I could necessarily be somewhere like that the whole time. You might have to sort of dip in and dip out, but I no longer appreciate the way things work here. Put it that way.
I'm the same.
I get pleasure from very simple natural things, and so I want to go where you can get those without being assaulted by the likes of Southern Rail or Tesco's or God knows what else.
And yet, to segue now into Brexit and what's happened there, that there was a certain undercurrent of there was I would call it a Hovis undercurrent of the old Hovis ads from CDP with the little boy cycling his thing up past the breadman, and this sort of Little Britain kind of, we're all back now as Britain, and the fucking union is just disintegrating. Like even Wales are now talking about secession, and it's just like, where do you see your own country? Obviously, it's big for us over here because we've now got a new head of the DUP who's a creationist who believes the world was invented 4,000 years ago and is coming into bat for a sizable proportion of loyalists in Northern Ireland.
I mean, just on Europe, on Brexit, I would be surprised if the EU survived all this, and particularly the financial aftermath. And I actually do think the way the EU behaved around vaccines was quite a good reason to leave, actually. The UK, again, this might be your theme. I don't care if people want to leave, let them leave. If it's an unnatural union, let it go. I just don't see. It's not worth something worth fighting for. Although maybe I shouldn't bring that one up. That was the one I remember talking to somebody about this when Brexit was sort of happening but hadn't happened. About devolution within the UK would be the next thing that would happen, and also it's not just the UK. It's southern Spain, and it's all of these areas. The baseline is the world is getting more and more connected, so therefore it's getting more and more volatile with bigger systemic risks. So that creates a level of anxiety. The solution to that anxiety, well, there are two things. One is a sort of commute backwards mentally to some sort of traditional period in the past, which may or may not have existed. The other solution is a sort of level of tribalism, because that again gives the perception of safety. So I think we're going to see it's going to get more and more tribal, but that doesn't have to be a bad thing. I mean, it could tip into xenophobia pretty easily and killing people, but it hopefully could end up in a slightly different direction. But, you know, I don't really see why does Scotland have to be sort of bolted to England? If they want to go, let them go. I mean, I think Ireland is a wholly different matter. I mean, I don't know how you square that one. But in terms of Wales and Scotland, I really don't see the problem, quite frankly. I mean, they were never together in the beginning. You know, we bolted them together. Yeah. So, you know,
along with about 80 other countries.
Countries are artificial constructs, and they ebb and flow over time. So I'm not too fussed.
No, but like as you said, like as soon as you began to say, well, you know, if people want to go from the union, let them go. I mean, it's worth fighting for. My initial gut reaction as an Irish woman was, well, you fucking, like talking about Northern Ireland, you broke it, it's your fucking problem. I don't want it back. Don't fucking hand it back to us. You fucked it up. It's your problem. No, you can have it. No. Thanks, but like, can you not just hang on to it for a bit? No. And I like there's a huge amount of that going on.
Yeah, this might be the first generation of Irish people, I'm talking about people who reach the age of 20, who a majority might vote against a united Ireland. I mean, they might.
I don't think so.
Well, I mean, it's coming close to that. We're getting to a point where we don't want the problem. It's, you know, it's old granddad stuff and whatever. Now, I think we have a gene of nationalism built into nearly everyone who's in the Republic of Ireland, but we kind of see the problems.
I would see a huge amount of republicanism up to age 35. And I'd say the age 35 to age 60 to 65 cohort would be like, just fucking leave it alone. We actually don't need this shit. Things are going fine. No thanks. I've kids going to university. I couldn't give a flying fuck about how many counties there are in Ireland. Most people like that. But anybody who, as I'm noticing, people who haven't settled down and had kids and basically had something fucking better to be thinking about are all really nationalist now, and like they're all brushing up on and they're Irish and they're all.
But I don't see the universe or catchment of 20-year-old men, 19-year-old men funneled into a paramilitary organisation building bombs.
That'd be the difference, because they care much more than when I was younger, like no one gave a fuck. It was the Celtic Tiger. We didn't really, sing the ass songs and you'd be Republican, but you didn't really give a shit. Whereas now I'm seeing young adults really give a shit, but the most they're going to do is set up a really poignant blog where they're going to say some hurtful things. They're not going to fucking pick up arms over it.
Yeah. What about the situation with democracy and Boris Johnson, who, despite what has happened in the last 12 months, probably seems stronger than ever in the polls? And this almost gravitation towards, I suppose if you take India as the biggest democracy, you can see how large democracy and America is very fatally flawed. The rise of the strongman, the fact that some of the countries in Asia and Southeast Asia who are borderline benign fascist states can galvanize their populations to meet challenges like this much more readily.
Again, this populism is driven by fear, by anxiety, and that can be anything from sort of geopolitics through to the economy, the pandemic, what have you. So I don't see that going away. I mean, it was interesting, that sort of split between, the countries best suited to deal with this were deeply authoritarian dictatorships, essentially. And, you look at somewhere like the States that had such a problem because of their federated nature, and even the UK, everyone's sort of doing their own thing. Although actually, against that, the Americans have done amazingly well with their vaccination program. So I'm not quite sure how that squares.
Well, it's military, they're very set up for military engagement. And when they put things on a war footing, they deliver. Like, I think Britain did that a bit as well. It was almost like they love a good war, and it was a war on a virus, and we have bullets to put into people's arms, so let's get them shot into people's arms kind of thing, But
on Boris, it's a bit like Trump. He was just sort of Teflon. He was bulletproof. And Johnson seems to be the same. I think he's made a hash of things. I don't think he's been a great prime minister. I think he's a bit of a fool. But then again, who else was there? I think Labour made an even bigger hash of it. And there's not really anyone else around in the Conservative Party. So he's a dreadful prime minister, but he's better than all the others, possibly. I also think that at some level people just don't care anymore. Again, it's this disengagement thing. We don't trust people anymore. We're disengaged from it. We all think they're much of a muchness, which they are. I mean, I think the level of corruption in the current cabinet is phenomenal. That'll come out at some point. I mean, it's come out already to some extent, but I'm not sure what the alternative is, really.
So the other thing from this tribal situation is the whole area of gender, and Don, maybe take this one.
Yeah, now I want to ask you, which is like, I'm laughing at your demeanour being a little bit, I have had enough of this shit. Huh?
Could you not ask me?
I was like, do you know what I'll do now? I'll ask him about gender. Fucking brilliant.
I don't care. I really don't give a shit. My general view is if people can do what the hell they like as long as it doesn't impact other people. So on that basis, I'm over it. I'm really not interested. I think it's gone far too far. In fact, yeah, I think it's just another example of the world gone completely crazy to some extent. Yeah. But I just don't care. I'm not interested. Sorry. It was a really good question and deserves a really good answer, but I'm not going to give you one because
we were planning a show on it, and it is a third rail, and it is this. You're asking to be cancelled, which the whole cancel thing is hilarious. Back to your point, when you understand that someone like Donald Trump can say the things he does and never even get as much as not suggested to be cancelled, not to mind, very clear present lies.
You can't be cancelled if, let's say if you're a racist, right? And if you're, or sexist, you're going out saying really overtly sexist things all the time, and it's kind of part of your shtick, and then people get on Twitter and go, you're a misogynist, you're a sexist, and fucking so.
Your point being.
Exactly.
I mean, what's worrying is, and I've come across this with some kids I know, is this thing where there is only one way to see the world, and any attempt to not even disagree, but to engage in a discussion is just seen as an absolute outrage. There's also this thing of, I guess it's sort of empowered individualism gone crazy, where people are allowed to be or say anything they like personally, but the minute somebody says something or is something that they don't like, they're incredibly offended. Mm. It's not a recipe for a sort of harmonious community, really, is it? I don't know. I mean, I'm really not sure what to say about it. It would be very interesting to examine what the sort of the deep undercurrents are with this stuff. What is actually driving this? Where has this sort of desire or need come from exactly? What at a very deep level is it expressing? But I have other things I'm more interested in thinking about, to be honest.
There's an issue here, I think, which is the end goal for someone who's on the left is not clear. You can go we're looking for utopia, which is the best outcomes for the most amount of people. That's kind of nice flag.
Yeah, but
then you kind of go, where exactly is the line? Where exactly are we trying to move to? We're clearly not looking for communism where everyone has the same bowl of rice and slice of bread every day, right? Which is the best outcome for the most people, possibly. So we're looking for what? We're looking for people to be respected, fine. We're looking for people to be allowed to express themselves, fine. Don't impose it on me. And it's kind of gone rogue and gone...
That seems really simple to me, because if you go straight back to the word conservatism is to conserve things as they are, stay the same, because it's working fine for me. Progressive is to progress. Then you go, well, what makes something progressive? Because I feel it's progressing. So I think, and I'm a lefty, but at the same time, I feel like the left, as it is now, is basically the opposition party to everything, which is fine, but you fucking run out of shit to oppose. To an extent, in most countries, the gay rights thing is kind of run out of steam because, now I'm not saying there isn't homophobia and there aren't problems, but in general, it's kind of run out of steam because we've moved on as a society. So then it has to go a bit further, and so we have to go on about the trans thing. Okay, live as you want. And people are kind of going, I don't really give a shit if someone's trans, they're walking down the street. Okay, well, that's not enough. Okay, well, I want you to call me your pronouns. Fine, we'll call you your pronouns. I want you to say it like you mean it. So and it's so funny because it reminds me of the punk movement, except the punk movement was supposed to be telling people to fuck off. And it's like, if you're 15, 16 and you've got your leather jacket on and you've got your fucking mohawk and mum and dad go, oh, that's lovely. I'm so delighted you're expressing your creativity. You go, fuck! What the fuck am I going to rebel with now? And I just see that happening because the left is literally, it's not just, fuck you, we're going to do what we want. We're going, we want the government to sign off on this, and we want everybody, and we want the police to have their rainbows too. Well, okay, well, what are you fucking rebelling against then? You're literally talking yourself out of a position.
So without that kind of clarity of what the end goal or the end Plato, and whatever the word for Plato is. So this society that we're aiming for, which we don't know what it is, and it can't be pinned down.
That's that. Okay, I think you've hit on the problem there. It's completely rudderless at the moment. Anyone can be anything, which is causing complete chaos. We don't know where we're going. Nobody is articulating a vision. I mean, I have no idea what Keir Starmer stands for, other than I'm not that guy. I don't know what Boris stands for. Everything's slightly merged into the middle. Nobody seems... I mean, basically, they believe in whatever a focus group tells them 51% of people believe in.
Yeah.
They don't have any true beliefs. They just follow what people tell them to be. I've written about this, and I think, I don't really believe in artificial general intelligence, this idea that, the machines are going to wake up and take over. I don't really buy that particularly. But if we get close to it, one of the things that it might do is force us to have a really big think about who we are, why we're here, and, what we do best, and how we're not AI. And Plato and Socrates were there before us all, discussing this. And going back to the pandemic, this is what was happening. At least I knew this was happening to me, and it was happening to people I know, that very first sort of week or two in March of last year, when people were having those conversations, what is a good life? Is this the way to live, and all the rest of it? And if we could sort of collectively agree, what a good life is, or where we want to go, and have some kind of long-term strategy, do a bit of the old cathedral thinking. So we're not doing it for us, we're doing it for the next generation. I think our identities would be more secure. You'd have less sort of mental health issues. There'd be less anxiety. There'd be less animosity. We might be sort of nicer, kinder people, but it's completely lacking. I mean, the only people that are articulating the vision, to my mind, is Silicon Valley. And their vision suits them. It doesn't suit 90 to 95% of the world. It suits sort of young white men with engineering degrees, most of whom are on the spectrum. It doesn't suit, a 40-year-old woman in Delhi particularly well. So I think we need to have a bit of a sort of a sit down as countries, as regions, as communities, as the entire planet, and, work out what it is that we want, where it is that we want to go. I thought that the pandemic might do this, but I think it's gone. It's just disappeared now. So you'd need another pandemic, which will definitely happen at some point, or aliens, or a war, or something really to force it, I suspect.
What about the aliens thing? There's all this new warblings coming out of America, that there's fighter pilots who've fucking seen things.
Yeah,
and
I had the best radio interview this week, I think it was Monday. American journalists wanted to discuss the impact of aliens on the future of work, which I thought was possibly the best I have ever been asked. And it went quite well, actually, because it got into that kind of AI, advanced AI area of, I think we can assume that they're a lot smarter than we are, so therefore certain jobs are going to be no longer our domain. And, it got actually quite an interesting, fun discussion at the end of the day. But, yeah, aliens would possibly do it, but we're going backwards, not forwards, that's for sure. I mean, it might be that climate could bring all this together, possibly. But the trouble with climate is it's not moving fast enough, and it's not... I'm not sure in terms of a climatic sense what sort of weather event would make everyone change their behavior overnight. We've had it all to some... Well, we haven't. We've far from had it. But, we've had the droughts and the floods and the winds, or some people have. And we haven't really changed that much. Although generationally, I think there's a change occurring. I mean, the biggest behavioural change around sort of climate and the environment is when they put 5p on a plastic bag, which says something.
Yeah.
I think you're onto something with the alien thing, because as you're saying that, I was going ridiculous, but also that's fucking genius, because we just moved on from talking about wokeism and the left and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, then I was thinking of the US and the Red Scare and McCarthyism. And it's like, what was great for that was a grand bit of 1970s alien shit and everyone getting real into the aliens and bunkers. That was a grand little kind of antidote.
Diversion,
yeah. And now we've got like McCarthyism again, just in a different format, but like ratting people out to their workplaces because they said this on Twitter and doxing people, all that kind of shit. And we just need a good fucking alien scare. And it may have to be somewhat AI related, just so it feels kind of, because there was like the space race at the time, so they may have to make it a bit more Silicon Valley-esque, but essentially we need another alien UFO type thing just to cure us of our bullshit.
Before we let you go, and again, possibly not for inclusion in the podcast, you seem quite, you flagged this beforehand, but you seem quite pessimistic or sort of flat about things, as someone who knows you very well.
I think flat's probably quite a good way of describing it. Pessimistic, not really. I mean, it's not like I'm worried, because that would imply a level of engagement. I think this sort of whole fear and loathing thing is a sort of Western European US thing. I think if you went into the Middle East or China or somewhere, or India, I don't think you'd really get this at all. Not in quite the same way anyway. No, I just see a lot of pointless chatter in the media with things I have no interest in engaging with, and I am increasingly being pushed in a direction I don't want to go in, but there's a way around that, which is to pack a suitcase and hang out somewhere else to some extent. I mean, this could all obviously go completely wrong, but yeah, I just want to sort of strip it down a bit and do my sort of Theroux or something. I don't know. I'm more interested in that sort of Southern European thing, particularly Italian, Greek, some extent Turkish, you could argue. Of just sort of living more in the moment, enjoying life, spending 3 hours having lunch, not really worrying about anything particularly. Yeah. I mean, if you want to sum up the feeling I'm after, it's Zorba the Greek. And delighting by the simplest thing and not exposing myself to this stuff that just drives you mad. I mean, you turn on the news, I go mad. You attempt to get on Southern Rail, you go mad, etc.
Well, so, I mean, certainly the place I feel most anchored is on the Greek islands. I feel this great link back to prehistory and if you think about what we see in Egyptian civilization that's left over that we can find out about, and bear in mind that it's like 5,000 years ago. It's 2,000 years before Christ. It's like an awful long time ago. And you see this very, very elaborate society with farming and with women being more empowered than probably they were 2,000 years after that. So, we have these kind of, I don't call it the good old days, but there seems to have been this ridiculous, possibly religion caused dark ages, which we call them, where we're only now starting to, in the last 200 years, 100 years, get shit together in terms of invention and progress and stuff like that. Not sure whether it's for the better or for worse.
I mean, this is like this fantastic focus group for a new antidepressant aimed at middle-aged men called Fuck It All, okay, 20 milligrams. Speak to your GP about it.
You've got me, it's Greece.
Yeah, same here.
It's the gods, it's the light, it's the history, that sort of edifice of so-called sophisticated Western culture just collapses at that point. The sort of the hubris just goes, and it's just the pleasure in a lemon or something. It's just, the sun on your back, a sort of wonderful level. So, we're clearly not talking about Mykonos.
We're not talking about Athens either.
Oh, actually, I have a real fondness for Athens, funnily enough.
Okay.
And I'll tell you another thing about Greece is it's not, well, from my perspective anyway, it's not necessarily trying to lead the world or be incredibly sophisticated, which Britain seems to have this hang-up of still having this empire and being on the top table and, we do have some seriously world-class stuff. And, life sciences we saw was one of them in recent months and year. But we sure as hell can't run a railway. Whereas, there's no pretense that the Greeks can run a railway. So I'm okay with that. There's no pretense that politicians aren't corrupt. So therefore I have no problem with that. Whereas here, they're all pretending that there are these incredibly sophisticated, holier than thou people. And the fact of the matter is, we've got this idiot for a prime minister who's, as Cummings correctly said, is in a sort of moral vacuum.
Greek friends of mine would obviously be very anti-Europe because, the first thing is Greece shouldn't have been let into Europe because it wasn't obeying any of the rules, and they kind of just let it in. It was, no one pays, not no one, but like all the taxation system is under the table. It's all dodgy as fuck. And okay, that's the way the country is. And the drachma was like, as soon as they went to the euro, all of that kind of collapsed. And, it's a good example of a country that you could argue, and the austerity they went through was savage because they hadn't got a bona fide infrastructure for paying taxes, whereas we did have in Ireland, and Iceland had that. And, we recovered better because we were good boys who towed the line. And yet you still go back to Greece and you still have the guys playing pétanque or whatever and sitting under the sun and drinking raki and going out in their fishing boats. And, it is a kind of a...
I think it's the most sophisticated country on the planet. And the other thing, actually, I think the current Prime Minister in Greece and the current government did one of the best jobs in the world. I mean, Australia, they haven't done badly. New Zealand obviously did very well. I was there twice last year, and compared to the situation here, there was total compliance on masks, none of this hidden disability stuff. Everyone was really obeying rules. It was a whole different ballgame. In fact, and they only got into trouble when they started letting some foreigners in last summer, really, as far as I can work out. But it was handled in a much, much different way. And I think there was tremendous respect for the government. So people actually were happy to comply with the regulations. I'm quite surprised at the level of compliance we've had here, given the amount of anger and so forth. And also the fact that the rules kept changing every 2 minutes. They were breaking their own rules. They were contradicting them. They were, you'd struggle to do another lockdown, I think. I mean, there are people suggesting that it might kick off again in September, October, partly because of India, but also actually, funny enough, back into China. I'm not sure would people do it again? I mean, Australia's been incredibly compliant as well. That's extraordinary. I mean,
they have that much to comply with, though. That's the thing.
Well, they haven't been let out of the country for a year, but 61% of them are fine with that.
Yeah.
So I guess when it becomes your dad and granny dying, people understand.
Well, that was the other thing with as I understood it with Greece. Whereas I think it's called a yaya, the grandmother, is such a central figure in Greek life. And generally speaking, you'd see her every single weekend. So you wanted to protect her. You didn't want to go crazy. Whereas here, not quite so much.
Yeah.
Did I tell you about the book I finished the week before the pandemic?
No.
Oh, so a week before the pandemic hit, I finished a book.
The book called Why We'll Never Have a Pandemic, that one?
No. No, actually, the pandemic's been in every single book I've written.
I know, yeah.
No, this book was called You Are Not Busy. And was finished the week before nobody was busy, apart from members of the NHS and essential services and the odd lawyer. So I'm just toying with the idea of whether I should reskin it with a sort of pandemic slant, based on the fact that we did have this period when very few people were busy.
Yeah.
Or I might just wait for us to all be busy again, in which case it'll be deeply relevant again. Douglas Rushcroft has written a book called Teen Human, which looks really good. Remember, he wrote a book called Present Shock, I think, about how crazy the present was. I've actually found it very difficult to read over the last year.
Yeah, a lot of people say that.
Yeah. There's too much churn in my head. I could read small things and I can write small things, but the idea of reading a whole book, or particularly writing a whole book, not a chance. But hopefully that's coming back. Obviously, Digital versus Human. Actually, that's the one book that probably doesn't have the pandemic in it. I was rereading Future Files, and that's most definitely got it in it. There's 50 Ideas About the Future. It's got a whole section on pandemics.
You have links to all of these books that Richard has mentioned, and go and buy some of his ones because they're very well written as well, and they're very engaging, and in many cases quite amusing.
Well, I think reading books is a good thing. Don't read the news. That's the important one. Read a book instead, and just sort of hug a tree and stare at a leaf for an hour.
Thank you as ever for being on the podcast, and we will have to come over and have a steak together. Either I'll go over to you come over here, and a large glass of wine, and you can smoke one of your big stogies.
Absolutely. That would be nice, wouldn't it? That would be extremely pleasant. I'm sorry about the gender one.
That's okay.
I could say things, but it could get me into so much trouble.
Yeah, it's a third rail.
Yeah.
You could be what the hell you like, but don't then start lecturing me about things. I think you actually picked it up. You know, you can, how you identify yourself could be anything you like, and I have no problem with that. But when you actually try to physically change sex, I do struggle with that a little bit. We are building up a phenomenal mental health problem back to mental health with people that have been allowed to do this too young. 5 years later, they change their mind or what have you, and it's like, oh my God. The other quite interesting thing, and I don't have a view on this, I just think it's interesting, is the world is fundamentally designed and set up for binary. The classic example of this obviously being prisons. There's men's prisons and women's prisons. If you put a man that's identifying as a woman into a woman's prison,
sport as well.
Yeah. I get that people have to live their life, and I'm not kind of saying do what you want but don't expect me to move. I am kind of saying, okay, well, we should make people more comfortable if we can. But the automatic assumption of, it's the entitlement that gets me. There's an assumption that women are just going to get out of the way, as we always do, because your sex-based rights are in the way, rather than, well, we're not willing to have a conversation with you because we disagree with you. We're not willing to work out a system. For instance, what they're doing now in the UK is they've moved the trans prisoners back out and saying, right, we better have a wing within the men's prison for trans prisoners. Grand, that makes sense. Fair enough. But like, it occurred to me, somebody made the point about the sports thing and all of that, is that they don't want a solution, because what the thing is, I want to force you to see me as I see myself. For some people, that was the draw. It wasn't about wanting to be on the team or it was about wanting to force other people to view them as their identity. And I kind of go, you can identify as you want. You can ask for people to respectfully address you in a certain way, but you're not entitled to my perception. In fact, I'm not even in control of my perception. But I don't care how you identify. You do what you want to do. But you're not entitled to how other people see you. What I think of you is none of your business.
You should be allowed to take the piss out of a bloke in a dress. Sorry, I mean, let's propose.
Oh, I think, actually, I'll tell you what I was watching last night was Airplane. And we were just talking about whether you could screen that now. Well, I mean,
no, probably not.
You just did. They screened it last night. But
yeah,
no doubt it'll have got all kinds of people outraged, because it's got some appalling racial stereotypes. It's got some gender stereotypes. There's physical violence. But it's funny. I don't think anyone is immune from having the piss taken out of them. I mean, I think putting that tragedy plus time equals comedy, that you might want to wait a bit on a few things, but generally speaking, if you can't have the piss taken out of yourself.
Nearly all comedy is laughing at someone else's misfortune. Nearly all comedy.
Yeah, but like there's subversive comedy as well, and that's what's been come after now. And I know, if you look at Father Ted, that's like Graham Innan is like the Antichrist, all things trans. But he's being picked up on other stuff like race stuff recently, and you're going, you do understand it's satire. Basically, he was coming out of a country where we were all kind of, it was a theocracy and it was all very fucking conservative, and he was making it cool to be a little bit liberal by taking the piss out of unfortunate things like racism and sexism and all of the things that we don't like. He was taking the piss out of them. It's like it's subversive comedy, but even now it's like, how dare you? This kind of shit moved a country on because all the young people went, yeah, this is fucking ridiculous, and laughed at it. So he's on the right side, him aside. But in general, I'm finding this with comedy where people are getting their knickers in a twist and deeply offended. And it's like, okay, you're offended. You're entitled to be, oh, I'm sorry, you thought we're not allowed to be offended anymore. Like, no one's allowed to offend us anymore. But that anything that touches on something that's distasteful is offensive. And there seems to be no intelligence to work out. You do understand that at least 50% of offensive comics tend to be subversive, and they're actually driving a progressive point forward. It's satire. Yeah. It's what helps people get a bit more fucking woke. And you're fucking wrecking it.
There was a guy called Martinez who wrote a book about, he was an engineer in Apple, and he also was a writer, and he wrote a kind of a snarky gonzo journalist book about the Silicon Valley set. And on one page in it, like it was a 400-page book or something, there was a paragraph saying that all women in Silicon Valley are, I don't know, I can't remember the exact words, but something like are social climbers and ugly to boot. Okay, something like that. And it was meant as a kind of a gonzo style. Anyway, Apple employees got hold of this, created a 2,000-person internal memo signature to say this guy should not be working in Apple because he expressed this hatred and distaste for women in Silicon Valley and is therefore a misogynist and should be fired, and was fired. And the book came out 5 years previously. Yeah. It wasn't that, I mean, it's probably been good for sales, but...
One thing I have noticed that I don't think's been picked up on, and I'm not even sure what the word for it is, there's a real hatred of men around.
Misandry.
Thank you. That's the
Sorry,
word.
I just woman-slaying that too.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah. But no, it sort of came out of the Me Too thing slightly, and, and you see it, funny, if you even see it in ads where you think, God, if that role was reversed, I mean, you could take piss out of men, I have no problem with it, but it was done in such a way where if you'd done it with a woman, there would have been an absolute outcry.
Yeah.
And again, it seems to be we never kind of get the balance. If it's right over there, it doesn't sort of swing back to a nice middle. It flies off over the other side half the time.
Yeah.
And then it sort of does this and comes back and comes back and comes back. But yeah, that's a sort of a new thing, I think, to some extent. And I'd hate to be sort of 16 in education right now as a bloke. I mean, my God, I wouldn't like an education period right now, but as a bloke, it must be bloody awful.
We actually talked about this on the last episode. We got into talking about misandry in general, and I was kind of talking about like the rising of it out of Me Too and the idea of toxic masculinity. And I do think there is toxic masculinity, but I was just saying, just to reiterate, I was saying I notice a huge toxic way in which we talk about masculinity. And like, I have a girl and a boy. Like, I want my girl to grow up feminist. I want my son to respect women and all of those things. And like, I'm bringing him up. Of course, I don't want him to be an asshole, but I also don't want him to be brought up to be ashamed of his gender, or that you either have to be really effeminate and one of the girls, but in order to be a strong man, that means you're an asshole. I see us denigrating masculinity rather than weeding out the problem. Some boys are going to be more feminine, and that's fine, but there are boys that are masculine, and we need to celebrate and look at male role models and positive masculinity. And I just don't see that. I see constant toxic masculinity. I see young boys growing up either deciding, you know what, fuck that, because if you're always being told that you're a sexist and a rapist, eventually you just turn into one of those blokes that goes, fuck that, I don't give a shit. Or you grow up with this deep sense of shame about yourself and this complex. And I don't want boys to grow up with this complex. So I see that as really damaging to young boys.
I have a theory which is kind of contradictory to your, I don't really worry about AI. That's probably a 200 to 300 year sort of theory that says if you look at where we're going, where you can't offend people, you can't say the wrong thing or else you're cancelled, that we're kind of homogenizing society, and gender is being allowed to float out into whatever you want it to be, which will in some ways mean a reduction in the birth cycle and the amount of births happening. And what we're slowly doing is sleepwalking ourselves into a computer with our phones in front of us, to the point where eventually there could become a time where the progression of the human race is that we actually realize that the fact that we're carbon-based eating and shitting machines can also be removed. And I'm now talking a little bit like Heads in Tanks and Futurama, whereby you end up that the best thing for society is, I think that there's a piece of magic dust in us that understands that the one thing we have to do as a species is get off the planet, because it's not going to end well. Right, so it's millions of years down the track, but we know that we're on a planet that is hurtling towards the sun or is going to melt eventually. And so when you look at someone like Elon Musk and people like that, they're understanding that interplanetary of something. You know, they're the Wright brothers. You know, just as I said, we did put a helicopter on Mars. Well, yeah, but imagine a planet where there is no humans, but we are still kind of, we're the Wizard of Oz behind the machines that are now built into the machines, and we're kind of walking that way ourselves without realizing it. That there could come a time when
there's some unbelievable technology. They're all anything half decent is too far away. And I mean, Mars is a flipping shithole and it's miles away. You know, and we've actually got this rather gorgeous planet that I think we should just take a bit more care of. I mean, I do slightly have the view that if we'll blow ourselves a bit, so be it. There'll be a nice planet left behind.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. The less stupid species can have another go at in another few billion years. I don't know. So
it's great looking at Chernobyl. You know, that documentary where nature has just overtaken Chernobyl in the last 30 years, and you see the deer walking down Main Street, Chernobyl, eating fruit.
What's that one with Will Thingy?
Yeah, I Am Legend.
I Am Legend. There's a bit of that going. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think as ever you are a legend, and thank you so much for being on the show again. We're probably going to check in with you annually because your temperature is always a good one to gauge.
I don't think I was particularly interested in that. I mean, I wouldn't be completely averse to doing that again if you wanted to, because I think you got me on a really bad day.
No, I think what I like about it, and I might even keep this in, is that one of the things I can be sure to get you is your mood. That's what we're trying to capture here. And I did call you up on it, and I can sense it from you. But that's also quite important. You know, I think just you sitting here being all, you know, happy days is a different podcast. And I think that we've come through a year of grind, you know, that may have been easier for some people, maybe have been easier for us because we have a bit more money or we have a bit more whatever. But people are jaded, and you know that's a much fairer reflection.
Actually, I'll tell you the word. I wish I could remember it. There's a German word which is the opposite of homesick, and it means longing for somewhere far away. That's me right now. I've been trapped for too long, and I think it's sort of messing with my head. But yeah, that's a good word, I think.
I prefer the authenticity of that then.
Yeah.
Just let Richard have a drink and a cup of coffee and a cigar, and let's try and pretend everything's okay. So always you're welcome on the show if ever you want to say something or plug your new book. I love the old You're Not Busy. There's lots of Richard's books in the blurb of the podcast where you can link in and buy them. They're very good reads. And I will see you over here for a pint maybe before the end of the year.
That's distinctly possible. A nice cold Guinness would go down a storm.
Yeah, if you're flying back from the States, route through Dublin and spend a couple of days here and put you up. All right, well, listen, look after yourself. And that was the wonderful Richard Watson there, Don. What did you reckon about that? I thought it was good to hear that he was, he was a bit upset that he wasn't as effervescent as normal, but...
Yeah, no, I find that interesting, not just because I'm usually the flat, pessimistic, sort of nihilistic one. So, it's nice for me not to... It's nice for someone else to be more miserable than me. It's not that, but I don't really tend to connect very well when people are just being too fucking optimistic for my liking, because it's just... No, it's not that I'm being a miserable bitch. I'm just kind of... I don't connect. I don't get it. It's not how I see the world. I find it very lonely. It's cold comfort to me. So I find it interesting when I can chat to someone, whether it's just the place they're in, the humour they're in at the moment, where they're a little bit flat and a bit which we're coming out of a pandemic. I think most people are a little bit, but so I find it interesting to be able to have a big conversation with someone when they've got a different take to me and they can talk about something that's of interest to me. But particularly if they're a bit flat, because it resonates with me, and I'm not used to that, because I'm used to everyone being just too fucking sunshiny about things.
There was a nice bit at the end when we sort of finished the podcast proper, when Richard told us that he did have a pet lamb.
I know.
So have a listen to this.
She's fine. Oh, the big news actually since we last spoke is we have we don't have him anymore, but we had a pet lamb in the house for 6 weeks. Ted, who I honestly say, Father Ted, I can honestly say we haven't laughed that much ever. Actually,
brilliant.
He was. I don't know quite why he was so funny, but he was. I'll send you a video. The flying sheep would be one of the videos. I've got more hits with my fucking lamb on LinkedIn than anything else.
You speak in the past tense. Did you put him with the mint sauce?
No. He did actually start eating garlic in the garden, which was a worry. He's getting himself ready. No, he's in the field behind us with his best mate Phil. His first night out, he had a big night out last night, because it was the first night in his life that he wasn't locked in at night. So he was roaming around East Sussex last night, as far as I can work out. So he's great.
Does he come up and say hello to you?
Oh God, yeah. He's like a dog.
Right.
Yeah.
But is he not going, why the fuck you put me out here? This is a fucking field.
He seems to sort of get into the sheep thing quite easily.
He identifies as a sheep.
Yeah. He was getting problematic because we had nappies on him and we couldn't get any big enough because he was 11 kilograms. He's quite big. So
don't assume his species.
He needed to go outside. But he's a good lad. He's a good lad.
But how did you end up with a pet lamb? Was it a rescue lamb?
It was a rescue lamb, yeah, absolutely. His mother rejected it.
Oh.
So she had triplets and could only feed 2, so she was kicking him around and refused to feed him.
Oh, well done.
And we got him about that big, and he ended up that big. I'll dig out a video at some point and send it over.
Okay, so he is still happy, and Richard's still happy, and it was nice to see that he got more views of his pet lamb than he did of some.
Can we have a lamb?
We can try. So that's about all we have time for this week, The Don. Look after yourselves. We'll be back within the next few weeks with another episode of A Pint with Seaniebee.
God bless, take care.